Today we'll be looking at Unit 7, Notes number 3, Challenges in the Movement. So we'll be seeing kind of new leaders who are emerging, disagreements with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and just kind of reasons why these divisions began to happen. De facto segregation. The problem facing African Americans in the North was de facto segregation. This is segregation that exists by practice and custom. So it's not a law. It's not something that people are forced to do. When you think about a community like Harlem, which is primarily African American, so when African Americans moved up north, they tended to live in communities, neighborhoods that were primarily African American. So that was a choice they made, but by making that choice, they are kind of almost segregating themselves by default. So de facto segregation can be harder to eliminate because it requires changing people's attitudes rather than repealing laws. De facto segregation intensified after African Americans migrated to northern cities during and after World War II. This caused tensions between African Americans and the white community. It also led to what is known as the white flight, where many white families left the cities and moved into the suburbs, leaving the cities and the urban areas primarily kind of housed by minorities. De jure segregation. Segregation that was determined by law was known as de jure segregation. This type of segregation was most targeted by the civil rights movement through their lawsuits, protests, and boycotts. However, just because laws changed did not mean that people's opinions changed as quickly. New leaders voice discontent. By 1965, the leading civil rights groups began to drift apart and new leaders would emerge. New African American leaders were urging their followers to take complete control of their communities, livelihoods, and culture. Malcolm X was one of these new leaders. Malcolm X was born Malcolm Little. He studied the teachings of Elijah Muhammad, the head of the Nation of Islam, also known as the Black Muslims, while he was in prison. And so he had changed his name from Malcolm Little. He had seen Little as a name given to his ancestors by slave owners, and the X kind of represented his rejection of that. After his release from prison in 1952, he became an Islamic minister and gained a following. He preached Elijah Muhammad's views that whites were the cause of the Black condition and that Blacks should separate from white society. So here, with Malcolm X, the Black Muslims, we see a different point of view that's very, in contrast to what MLK is preaching, which is, desegregation, integration, learn to live together, where they're preaching no, the white community is responsible for us, for our condition, um, basically viewing the entire white community as an enemy, and that they want to separate. They don't want to be integrated. They want to have their own community. So, again, very different goals, very different ideas. Malcolm's message appealed to many African Americans and their growing racial pride, and just the frustration that many were feeling at the time with not seeing change happening as quickly as possible. Ballots or Bullets. So, this is the title of a very famous speech that Malcolm X delivered. So, here's a quote: "It'll be the ballot or it'll be the bullet. It'll be liberty or it'll be death. And if you're not ready to pay the price, don't use the word freedom in your vocabulary." So, with this speech, many people kind of misinterpret it sometimes, feeling that he's calling the Black community to be more militant and aggressive. But what he's actually saying that we have two choices, and he wants it to be the first. He wants it to be, let's go out and vote, let's exercise our freedom that way. But when people aren't allowed to do that, and there's all these obstacles in the way, that the frustration ends up leading to bullets. But he doesn't want it to go that route. By 1964, Malcolm had broke with Elijah Muhammad over differences in strategy and doctrine and formed another Muslim organization. Malcolm embarked on a pilgrimage to Mecca in Saudi Arabia, where he learned that Islam preached racial equality. While worshiping and praying, he saw that Muslims were very diverse. Some were had very light skin with blue eyes, some had darker skin, and kind of really saw that it is possible for people of different skin colors to work together. And it really did like change his whole perspective. When he returned to the United States, his attitude towards whites changed. And this led him to split from the Black Muslims as he no longer followed their ideology and their doctrine. Because of his split with the Black Muslims, Malcolm believed his life might be in danger. Because he was such a big figure, he kind of took away. So you can kind of see them as maybe being kind of jealous or offended that he no longer wanted to be a part of them. On February 21st, 1965, while giving a speech in Harlem, Malcolm X was shot and killed. So he was one of, not the first person within the civil rights movement to be killed, but one of the first leaders to have been shot and killed. I also have a picture here of him and MLK together. And I think this was one of the very few times, the only time that they actually met and were photographed. So even though people are within the civil rights movement, you would think they cross paths a lot, but that is not necessarily true. So let's stop and think. How did the viewpoint of Malcolm X evolve? So we see him first kind of advocating this separatist point of view. Let's blame the white community. We cannot work together. But as he really kind of becomes more involved with his faith and learns about more diversity within his own religion, his viewpoint changes and realizes that yes, it is possible for people of different skin colors to work together. And so kind of begins to kind of start to preach that message. But unfortunately, he was killed before kind of that message could be more proliferated. Black Power. The split in strategies was becoming more evident with the SCLC, SNCC, and CORE. As the leader of the SCLC, MLK was insistent on a nonviolent approach, whereas the leaders of the other groups were not as convinced. Stokely Carmichael, the leader of SNCC, remember SNCC was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, so they tend to skew, their group members are younger, college age type people. So Stokely Carmichael urged SNCC to stop recruiting whites and to focus on developing African American pride. He called for Black people to begin to define their own goals and lead their own organizations. The slogan Black Power became the battle cry of militant civil rights activists. Black Panthers. The Black Panthers were organized to fight police brutality in the ghetto in Oakland. They advocated self sufficiency for African American communities as well as full employment and decent housing. They were known to dress in black leather jackets, black berets, and sunglasses. They preached self defense and sold copies of the writings of Mao Zedong, leader of the Chinese Communist movement. The Black Panthers were often targets of FBI investigations because of their kind of radical views, associating themselves with communism. So remember, we're still like very deep in the middle of the civil rights movement. I'm sorry, the Cold War. The war in Vietnam is going on, so we haven't touched on that yet. So there's still kind of a lot of things happening within the 1960s, and kind of associating with yourself with communist literature does not help your cause during this period, even though they're seeing ways to help out their community. And so their activities help to contribute to the establishment of daycare centers, free breakfast programs, free medical clinics, and other services aimed to help the African American community. 1968, a turning point. MLK objected to the Black Power movement. He believed that preaching violence could only end in grief. On April 4th, 1968, MLK was shot on his hotel balcony in Memphis. The day before MLK was shot, he delivered a speech where he urged his followers to go on even if he was not there with them, which is, did he know he was going to be shot? I'm sure he felt that at this point he had received many death threats. This is, a few years after Malcolm X was killed. And so he really, didn't know what could happen to him, but it's just very um, strange to kind of say something like that the day before he gets killed. As news of MLK's death spread, it led to the worst urban rioting in United States history. Over 100 cities exploded in flames. The hardest hit cities were Baltimore, Chicago, Kansas City, and Washington, D.C. Legacy of the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement ended de jure segregation by bringing about legal protection for the civil rights of all Americans. Congress passed the most civil rights legislation since Reconstruction, including the Civil Rights Act of 1968. This ended discrimination in housing. After school segregation ended, the number of African Americans who finished high school and who went to college increased significantly. This led to better jobs and business opportunities. Another accomplishment of the civil rights movement was to give African Americans greater pride in their racial identity. African Americans also made substantial political gains. Affirmative action. To help equalize education and job opportunities, the government in the 1960s began to promote affirmative action. Affirmative action programs involved making special efforts to hire or enroll groups that have suffered discrimination. Many colleges and almost all companies that do business with the federal government adopted such programs. But in the late 1970s, some people began to criticize affirmative action programs as reverse discrimination that set minority hiring or enrollment quotas and deprived whites of opportunities. In the 1980s, Republican administration eased affirmative action requirements for some government contractors. So let's stop and think. What is the legacy of the civil rights movement? So we see a lot of change. Some of the big court cases, like Brown versus the Board of Education, ending segregation. We see a lot of other court cases challenging segregation on buses and trains. And we see legislation that's being passed to so that these court cases don't have to go up specifically to target the Civil Rights Act of 1964 ended discrimination in all kind of public accommodations. Civil Rights Act of 1968 ended discrimination in housing. Also, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So we see lots of big legislation, lots of new leaders emerging, like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, to kind of represent what people were feeling. And so we see a lot of progress that was made. However, I think with the kind of events that we see today, we can tell that still more work needs to be done so that everyone in our country can feel that um, they can exercise all of their civil rights. So go back, finish your key terms, and start preparing for our quiz next week.